In this first trig video, we are going to be looking at drawing angles and how to name them. So first thing, we want to define an angle back from our geometry days. An angle is two rays sharing a common endpoint called the vertex. So your vertex is right here. In fact, let's label that in red. And then we have different sides of our angle. So this might be some new terminology. We have our initial side, which is our starting side. And then we'll draw an arrow going, kind of a curvy arrow. We'll label it with theta. This is a popular label for our angles. And then the ending side is called the terminal side. When you graph angles, and when we're talking about graphing angles, we're going to be looking at it in what's called a standard position. Positive angles are going to go in a counterclockwise direction. From the initial to the terminal, which is kind of how we already drew up the angle up here. And a negative angle is going to go in just the clockwise direction. Similar to the way we label our quadrants. When we label our quadrants, we go counterclockwise, and we'll be using the quadrants and our axes to help us with drawing angles later on. So just three examples of angles down below. We have a positive that's less than 360 degrees. Would look like the one we just drew up above. A negative angle, if we were going to label this with a negative, we would just go all the way around in the clockwise direction. Kind of looks like a little Pac-Man. Now I just put a greater than 360, but just a little star here. We could also graph less than 360 and go in the clockwise direction. So with greater than 360, we'll go around at least one full time before going to the angle. Depending on how much greater than 360. If it's 720 degrees more, then we would go around twice. So as many times around that you go 360 is how many extra loops you have drawn. So here we have like one extra loop plus the angle measurement there. All right, in order to get these angles always in like a standard spot, we have what's called standard position. In standard position, we are always going to put our initial side is going to be on the positive x-axis. And our terminal side will be, I'm going to put this one in the second quadrant and make an obtuse angle, but it could be anywhere. The initial has to always start on the positive x-axis, and then the terminal will be based off of that. And then we always want to draw in between there an arc and label it with our angle measurement. So we're going to take a chance to practice some of these, but before we do that, just to distinguish between the two types of angles you're going to see. If we have something that lies in a quadrant, it's similar to the one I just did, so I'll just do a different one here that lies in the third quadrant. This would be the angle 225. And in this example, it's actually, hold on. This was in quadrant 3. The standard angle I drew up above is in quadrant 2, so important to remember those things. And then for quadrantal angles are going to be your angles that are right on the axis. So 0, which would also be 360 when we come full circle around. Let me go counterclockwise, 90, 180, and 270. So we're breaking it into those 4 quadrants or 4 axes by those angles. So these are angles on the X and Y axis. All right, let's take a look at some examples down below. Our first angle we're drawing is a 45-degree angle. So you always want to put your terminals or initial side on here. Make sure you just put an extra arrow on if you really can't darken it in on the axis. And then 45 degrees, we're going to use our 90 as a reference. 45 is halfway in between, so I want to try to make it look like it's going halfway in between on that quadrant. And then draw a little arrow to show that we're going the 45 degrees. It's a little tight to label it on here, but since we're only doing one angle at a time, that's okay to not fully label it. The 240 degrees, we're going to start labeling our outside. So 0, 90, 180, and 270. Use those as a reference. So 240 is going to be in the 3rd quadrant, kind of closer to the 270 than the 180. So I'll make it look a little bit closer. Always put your initial side on there. Again, if you can only get just the arrow on, that's fine. And then we want to draw a loop going in the direction that we're drawing the 240. This one I have a little more space to label it, so I'm going to put the label on there for the 240. So notice we're going counterclockwise for both, and I'm just going to put that this one is in quadrant 1. And this is in quadrant 3. A lot of times with quadrants we label with Roman numerals. That can get a little tricky if you make your 3s and 4s kind of look similar. So it's okay to just write 1 and 3 instead if you think that's going to be better for you and your handwriting. Now with a negative angle, we can almost kind of do the same thing. I'm going to start here at 0, but just go in the negative direction and make this negative 90, negative 180, negative 270. That'll make it easier to draw this particular angle without too much extra thinking about where it's going to go. So negative 210 is going to be in the 2nd quadrant, kind of closer to the 180. So I'll make that a little bit closer there, and then label that as negative 210. Notice I started on the axis right here and went in the clockwise direction to draw my arc. Now 405 is bigger than 360. So there's a couple options here. You can keep labeling your outside, or if you take 360 away from this, which I think is one of the easier ways to do it and kind of leads us into our next topic, we subtract 360 from 405, we get 45 degrees, which tells us where to put our angle. So that tells us it's similar to the first one. We're going to put our angle, our terminal side, right in the middle. Your initial side still goes on the positive x-axis, but when you draw, you're going to go one full circle around first and then continue on to the 45 degrees. So we're going to stop this video here. In our next video, we'll look at this a little further algebraically and talk about something called coterminal angles.